The wind wasn't wind. It was thinner than breath, sliding across the skin like the whisper of something watching. Every step crunched in frost that wasn't ice, that wasn't snow, but some alien crystal dust that glittered sharp as powdered. Stars. Her bare feet bled where it cut her, leaving a trail of smudged crimson across the pale ground. She didn't look back, not because she didn't care who followed, but because she already knew what was there. She could hear them in the silence, their shadows pressing into her spine. She pulled the torn edges of her silver-woven cloak tighter, though the cold slid through fabric and flesh like it had the right to live inside her. Somewhere out here, the night wasn't just a time of day. It was a thing, a breathing presence, that swallowed the slow and the weak. She had been running since the moon's rose, two pale crescents like broken nails across the dark. They had been chasing her since before that. In the soft gleam of their fractured light, her face was a trembling reflection of exhaustion and fear. But her eyes were alive, catching every flicker of movement, every shift in the shadows. Her world had taught her what happened to girls who didn't keep moving after sunset. Her people didn't survive alone. Not out here, not with the hunters prowling. She could still smell them. The scent clung to her mind like a rotting memory, coppery, wet, and edged with a metallic sweetness that didn't belong to anything human. They were close. She knew they were close. Her breath came out in jagged bursts, every exhale a puff of pale mist that the cold tore apart before it could rise. Ahead, the horizon swam with a low haze, faintly golden, as though something warm still lived in this dead expanse. She stumbled toward it, knees buckling, heart screaming against the cage of her ribs. The warmth was a lie. It had to be. She had grown up on lies like that, the promise of safety in a land that had none, the illusion that help would come for those who called loud enough. But still, her body moved toward it like instinct, like hunger. She didn't even notice. Her voice at first, whispering words in a language that wasn't her own. Not really speaking to the air, but to something she hoped might be listening. "Take me home, human, please." The wind stole the sound before it could fall, but she said it again, louder this time. Because if the stories were true, there was only one thing out here more dangerous than the night. And maybe, just maybe, that thing could save her. The golden haze thickened as she limped closer. And with each breath, it tasted more real. Not the cold, metallic air she had been breathing for hours, but something heavy with heat and dust, like old machinery. Her cracked lips trembled. She had never smelled a machine before, but the stories described it exactly like this. Heat meant power. Power meant the kind of strength that could kill the hunters before they tore her apart. Or it meant a trap. Her vision swam, but she forced her body forward, fingers grazing the jagged ribs of frost-covered rock for balance. Somewhere behind her, the ground crunched again. Not her footsteps, heavier, slower, measured the sound of something that wasn't hurrying because it knew she couldn't escape. She didn't dare look back. She knew the hunters liked their prey to see them just before the end, liked to watch the moment the fight went out of their eyes. A flicker cut across the haze ahead. A shape, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with an unnatural precision. It didn't blend into the landscape. It broke it, like reality bent around it in ways her mind wasn't ready to hold. For a moment, she thought the cold had finally taken her mind. But then the shape moved again, the glint of metal catching moonlight, and she realized this wasn't some storyborn monster. This was worse. This was human. The sight almost made her stop running. Humans weren't supposed to be here, not this far from the cities, not on nights like this. The old women in her village had spoken of them like something you called only if you were ready to pay a price. They didn't come for kindness. They came because they wanted something you couldn't keep. Her steps faltered anyway. The shape was closer now, and with it came the low hum of something alive but not breathing. Heat rolled off it in waves, melting the frost where it stood. In the blur of her failing sight, she saw the human's head turned toward her. No face visible, only the sharp silhouette of a visor, and something in the way it tilted, calculating, weighing her against whatever danger followed. Behind her, the crunch of pursuit quickened. The hunters had closed the distance. She didn't think. She only moved, stumbling toward the human like a child running toward fire to escape the dark. She didn't know if it would save her or kill her, but either way, she would not die in the teeth of the night. The frost behind her shattered under the hunter's weight. They were no longer pacing her. They were rushing, confident the kill was seconds away. Her legs screamed with every step, the skin of her feet shredded and raw. But the sight of the human, still and solid in the heat haze, pulled her forward like a hook buried deep in her chest. She didn't know if he could even hear her. Over the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears, but she kept calling anyway, her voice breaking apart into ragged sobs. The air shifted. A hiss not from the hunters, but from the human rippled through the cold like a blade through water. He moved with a speed that didn't belong in a body that size, closing the distance between them in heartbeats, she barely registered. The blur of motion before something hard and impossibly strong wrapped around her arm, hauling her off her feet as though she weighed nothing. The sudden heat of his grip burned through the numbness in her skin, the warmth so alien it hurt. The hunters burst from the shadow in that same moment. She caught only flashes, jaws hinged too wide, glinting rows of teeth, limbs bent wrong, for running yet carrying them faster than any human stride. Their eyes were pits of reflected moonlight, locked not on her but on the figure that now stood between them and their prey. She heard the human's voice, then low, unyielding and shaped in a language she didn't know. But the tone carried something that bypassed words entirely, a promise that the hunters would not pass. A sound like metal snapping filled the air, and light flared from his side. Blinding against the black of the night, the hunters slowed, their bodies tensing as if the darkness itself had whispered caution to them. But hunger is stronger than fear. One lunged, its teeth slicing the air just short of her leg. And then there was no air at all, only a sudden, violent pressure wave that hit her like a wall. The world tilted. Her ears rang with a sound that didn't belong to nature. And when her vision cleared, the hunter was gone. Not dead. Gone. As though erased, the human's grip tightened briefly. A silent command she didn't understand but obeyed. Whatever this thing was, whatever price he would demand later, he had just made the night afraid. The human didn't wait for her to speak. One moment, the cold was gnawing her bones. The next, she was being dragged through a curtain of shimmering air that rippled like water and smelled faintly of scorched metal. Her feet hit a surface that wasn't the frost-stained ground, but something smooth, hard, and faintly warm under her bloodied soles. The night's roar dulled instantly, as if they had stepped into another world that the hunters could not follow. Her breath caught. Around her, walls of metal rose like cliffs, curving upward into shadows she couldn't see the end of. Thin lines of light traced across the surfaces in slow pulses, breathing in perfect rhythm with something unseen. The air was thick, alive, humming with an energy that made her skin prickle. She had heard the word ship before, whispered in the half-believing way children talk of monsters. This had to be one. A human ship. The human released her arm, but didn't move far. Up close, he was even less like the men from her village's tales. The suit clung to him in sleek, angular plates that shifted when he moved, and where skin should have been, she saw only dark composites and faintly glowing seams. The visor hid his face entirely, a blank mirror that reflected her own ragged, frost-burned image back at her. She took a step back, but the floor tilted under her, sending her stumbling forward again. No, it wasn't the floor moving. The whole place shifted, an almost imperceptible lurch that made her stomach knot. Somewhere deep in the ship, machinery awoke with a low, rolling growl, like a predator announcing its presence. Beyond the shimmering air they'd come through, the frostland was already vanishing into black. She could just barely make out shapes. Pacing along the invisible barrier, their movements sharp with frustration. The hunters would wait. They always waited. The human turned toward a narrow corridor lit with pale, shifting light. Without looking back, he started walking. His steps were soundless, measured. She hesitated, every instinct screaming not to follow. But outside was death now, certain and merciless. Inside was unknown, and unknown was a risk she could still survive. She limped after him, each step echoing in the metal throat of the ship. Her whisper trailing the sound like a shadow. "Take me home, please." The corridor swallowed her whole. It was long, narrow, and curved in a way that made her feel like she was inside the bones of some enormous beast. The air was warmer here, but it wasn't the comforting warmth of a hearth. It was mechanical. Dry, threaded with the faint tang of ozone and something sharper. Chemical that clung to the back of her throat. Her breath sounded too loud. Each inhale scraped her lungs, reminding her how thin the frost world's air had been. The human walked ahead without pause, the light along the corridor shifting as he passed. As though the walls themselves were aware of him, she followed his movements like she might follow the beam of a torch through a collapsing mine. Every step made her more aware of how her body had been stripped to exhaustion. Her knees buckled every few paces. Her shoulders drooped, and the torn fabric of her cloak kept catching against the smooth wall, making her wince. Still, she didn't dare stop. She told herself she'd ask him where they were going, but her voice wouldn't come. It wasn't just fear. It was the sense that any sound, any question, might be the wrong one, and in the wrong place, wrong. Words could cost you everything. She'd learned that lesson too young. So instead, she clutched the ragged edges of her cloak and let her eyes flicker over the details. The strange, shifting patterns in the wall metal, as thin tubes that ran, like veins beneath translucent panels. The faint vibration beneath her bare feet, almost like a heartbeat. They passed doorways, sealed, silent, until one finally opened as the human approached. The room beyond was larger than her entire dwelling back home. Light bled from the ceiling in a steady, golden wash, revealing smooth, low structures she couldn't name. Against one wall stood something like a table, though its surface was alive with movement, lines of light bending and coiling into shapes she half recognized. Maps, perhaps. Though none matched the broken peaks and frozen rivers of her land, her heart sank in a way she hadn't expected. It hit her then, the quiet realization that she might never see her home again, not because she couldn't get back, but because there might be nothing left to go back to. She thought of the others who had been taken, of the screams swallowed by the cold, of the smoke curling into the night when the hunters had first descended. That night, she had run instead of staying to fight. She'd told herself she was finding help. But what if she had only been running toward the end of everything? She knew. The human turned, visor still hiding whatever face lay beneath, and gestured to one of the low structures. A bed, she guessed, though it was too smooth, too uniform, its surface rippling faintly like the skin of a still pond. Her legs folded under her before she could decide, and the bed's surface shifted to cradle her weight. It was almost too much, the sudden warmth, the way her muscles seemed to unravel into this strange support. She wanted to close her eyes, to drift into the dark and let this strange place keep the hunters away. But she remembered the way the old women in her village told their warnings about humans. They will give you safety, until they ask what you're willing to pay for it. Her voice came out small, cracked, as she forced herself to speak. You'll take me home. The human didn't answer, not with words. Instead, he turned back to the living table, his gloved hands moving across the light, shifting the strange maps into sharper detail. One by one, the symbols on them began to vanish, blinking out like dying stars. She didn't know their meaning, but she understood enough. Something was disappearing, and the way his shoulders stiffened told her that whatever was gone wasn't coming back. Outside the ship, the hunters were still waiting. Inside, a different kind of predator was already deciding her future. The table's light bent and shifted. Again, its moving lines weaving together into something new. She didn't understand the symbols, but their motion reminded her of water under moonlight fluid, alive, pulling her eyes toward it whether she wanted to look or not. The human stood still for a moment longer, visor tilted down, as if weighing what to say. When his voice finally came, it was steady and low, but shaped in the harsh, clipped rhythm of his own tongue. She flinched. She couldn't make sense of the sounds. They struck the air with too much precision, too much sharpness, like tools cutting stone. Still, the tone told her things, the kind of careful tone you use when speaking to someone who's already bleeding but still dangerous enough to matter. He must have realized she didn't understand, because he reached to his belt, unclipped a small, flat device, and placed it on the table's edge. It pulsed faintly, a thread of blue light running through its center. When he spoke again, the sound was different, still his voice, but smoothed, reshaped, as though the air itself was twisting it into words she knew. "Your home," he said, "isn't where you left it." Her stomach twisted. "You don't know where it's gone. No pause, no mercy. The place you came from." The night swallowed it. "You weren't running toward me. You were running from what was already finished." She stared at him, her throat burning. That's not, but the table betrayed her. It shifted again, showing an image she couldn't deny. The jagged outline of the peaks she had known since childhood, the frozen rivers winding between them. Then, in a slow, deliberate sweep, black spread across it like ink spilling through water, erasing the light until only a faint outline remained. The hunters moved through that darkness, their shapes larger than she had ever seen, their paths marked in blood-red trails. She tore her eyes away, curling her fingers into the fabric of her cloak. "There are others. They not anymore." The device made his voice too clear, too real. Every word landed like a stone. She wanted to scream at him, to demand he take her back so she could prove him wrong, but part of her already knew he wasn't lying. The cold in her bones wasn't just from the frost outside anymore. It was from the hollow, collapsing space inside her chest. She forced herself to look up at him. "Then why take me?" The visor didn't move. "Because you're not finished yet." He turned away before she could ask what that meant, the light of the table casting his shadow long across the metal floor. Somewhere beyond the ship's walls, the hunters shifted in the dark, their movements impatient. They were waiting for the moment she'd have to step outside again, and suddenly she wasn't sure if the human was keeping her from them, or keeping her for something worse. The human's shadow slid away from her as he crossed the room, his steps so silent it felt like the ship itself was swallowing the sound. The table's glow dimmed to a faint ember, leaving only the pulse of the walls for light. She stayed seated on the strange bed, her body begging for rest, but her mind sharp with a new, unsettling focus on his words. "You're not finished yet." The phrase dug into her thoughts like a splinter. It wasn't rescue language. Rescue meant you're safe now. Rescue meant it's over. This was different. This was a statement that carried weight. The kind that came with expectations she hadn't agreed to. He reached the far wall and placed a hand against a smooth panel. It opened with a sound like a sigh, revealing a narrow compartment lined with dark shapes she didn't recognize until one caught the light. Metal. Molded into a form that was half weapon, half machine. He didn't take it out. Instead, he stood. They're looking at it the way people look at graves they aren't ready to walk away from. You know what they are? He said finally, still turned away from her. Her hands tightened in her lap. She knew what he meant. The hunters. Everyone knew them. They've always been here, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. Before I was born, before my mother was born. He shook his head. No, they weren't here. They came. Here. His tone carried that same deliberate precision, every word sharpened to cut. They took your world piece by piece. They leave nothing behind. That's what they are. And they're not finished yet either. Her pulse quickened. Then? Why me? Why pull me out instead of letting them? Because you've been close enough to see them and still live. He finally turned, the black mirror of his visor aimed straight at her. Most people who've been that close don't. She felt her breath catch. She'd never thought of it that way. She'd been running for so long, she'd never stopped to realize just how few others had managed to escape. And now, in the quiet of the ship's strange warmth, the memory of that night pressed hard against her ribs. The screams behind her, the sound of splintering doors, the way the frost lit red where the hunters passed. The human stepped closer, stopping just far enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his suit. You saw something, he said. Something you're not telling me yet, and I need it, because the next place they go won't get a warning. She swallowed, her mouth dry. Part of her wanted to tell him everything, to spill the images. Still burning in her mind, the shapes she'd seen moving inside the hunter's shadows. But another part, the part that had kept her alive this long, held it tight. Outside, a deep low thud rolled through the walls. Not the sound of the hunters. This was heavier, further away, but closer than safety should allow. The human turned, his head slightly toward the sound, the barest shift in his stance, and in that moment she understood. Whatever wasn't finished yet. It was already moving again. The thud came again. Closer this time, a deep vibration that settled into the floor and worked its way up her bones. The bed's strange surface rippled in response, as if the ship itself had flinched. She gripped the edge instinctively, her nails catching against the smooth material. The human didn't move right away. He stayed perfectly still, head tilted, listening with a focus so complete it was as though nothing else existed. When the third impact rolled through, heavier and sharper, he moved fast, precise, back to the table. The surface came alive. Again, lines of light folding into a map so complex it hurt to follow. A section pulsed red, not the hunters. This was bigger. Stay here, he said, and for the first time, there was an edge in his voice that sounded like something human. Urgency. Not panic, not fear, but the sharp tone of someone calculating risks in real time. She stood before she realized it. What is it? He didn't answer. His hands moved across the map, pulling up layers of detail the frost field outside. The jagged ridges, the dark nothing beyond. Then, from beneath those layers, something rose into view. It was a shape buried deep, moving with a slow, deliberate crawl toward where the ship was anchored. The walls hummed differently now, the steady pulse quickening like a heartbeat under strain. She felt the air change heavier, charged, prickling. Against her skin, whatever was under the frost wasn't trying to hide. It was coming. She took a step closer to the table, her voice low. Hunters don't move like that. his visor angled toward her for the briefest second before returning. To the map, it's not hunters. The floor jolted under their feet, a sharp, metallic groan rising from somewhere deep in the ship's frame. She glanced toward the shimmered barrier she'd entered through, half expecting the frost to burst inward, but the distortion remained. Steady, holding back the endless white. Another impact hit, stronger than the last, and the whole room seemed to flex around it. The table's light fractured for a moment, scattering into a mess of symbols before reassembling. She saw the shape again, closer now, almost beneath them. It was massive, its outline shifting in ways her eyes didn't like, as if its form wasn't fixed. The human moved toward the compartment in the wall, this time pulling the weapon free. The metal unfolded in his hands, plates sliding apart with a hiss until it was longer than her arm and crowned with a cluster of dull black teeth. He checked something along its side, and the teeth began to glow faintly, a sickly, unnatural red. "Stay here." The words were clipped, final, like a lock clicking shut. But she already knew she wouldn't. Not if that thing broke through. Not if it was worse than the hunters. And deep down, she suspected it was. The first sound wasn't the frost breaking, it was the frost screaming. A high, sharp crack that splintered the silence outside, multiplying into a cascade of shattering, like glass under a hammer. Then came the roar. Not a beast's roar, not something that belonged to breath or lungs. This was deeper, wrong in its shape, like the sound of a mountain remembering it had once been alive. She stumbled toward the barrier, pulled by the sound against all reason. Through the shimmering veil, the frost field was no longer still. The ground heaved in slow, rolling waves, white dust lifting into the air like smoke from 1,000 unseen fires. Shadows twisted in that cloud, hints of vast shapes moving beneath, and then the surface ruptured. It wasn't an emergence. It was a tearing. The frost split open in a jagged spiral, and something pushed its way through long, spined limbs that pierced the surface first, flexing in the cold light. They didn't move like animal limbs. They moved like machines that had learned to hate. The body followed, dragging itself up in pieces, its outline shifting as though its skin couldn't decide what it was made of. The hunters, the ones who had been pacing the barrier, stopped. She'd never seen them stop. They turned toward the breach, their bodies lowering in a strange, almost submissive stillness. Not fear. Recognition. Her stomach turned. Whatever was coming through wasn't just worse than the hunters, it was something the hunters served. Behind her, the human moved into position, weapon raised. The black teeth at its end burned brighter now, their glow pulsing in sync with the hum building in the walls. He didn't shout, he didn't run. He stood, like he'd been waiting for this. The thing rose higher, its torso dragging free of the frost. It wasn't a shape that fit into her mind. She tried to track its edges and failed, her eyes slipping from one impossible angle to another. Pieces of it were metal, others flesh, others something she couldn't name, shifting planes of colorless material that reflected the world wrong. Its head, if it could be called that, tilted toward the barrier. And then it saw her. She felt it, a pulling, as if the space between them had been hooked and reeled in. Her breath hitched, her hands trembling without her telling them to. The human's voice cut through the pole like a blade. Back, one word, sharp enough to anchor her. She didn't move. Couldn't? The thing kept watching her, not the ship, not the human. Her dot, then the barrier shook.